Sarah Vantine counted the shape twice before she trusted it. One man, on foot, not on horse, coming up out of the drift line where the creek bent past the cottonwoods the November wind had already taken down. She didn't know yet if that mattered. She only knew her husband had ridden out 6 days ago, sitting tall in the saddle on a sound horse, and whatever was crossing her yard right now was walking, bent low, dragging one boot like the snow had opinions about where it wanted to go. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and tallow and the particular sourness of wet wool drying too close to a stove, and under the window the wind worked at the chinking the way it had worked at it every day for 3 weeks, looking for a way in and mostly failing. Somewhere behind her, Daniel was humming a tune with no name to it, and the small sounds of an ordinary evening, a spoon against a pot, a log settling in the firebox, made the shape in the yard feel like something from a different and much worse world, trying to push its way into this one. She set down the dipper, called for May, without raising her voice past the register that wouldn't frighten a 6-year-old. "Keep your brother by the stove." May didn't ask why. 8 years old, and she'd already learned the difference between her mother's regular voice and the one that meant something needed doing quietly. She took Daniel's hand and pulled him back from the window, back into the gold thrown by the little cast-iron stove, back among the quilts. The quilts were everywhere now. Sarah had nailed batten strips along every interior wall 3 weeks back, hung every scrap of pieced cloth in the house off them wedding ring patterns. From her mother, a log cabin block she'd traded a dozen eggs for, even Daniel's old crib quilt, too small to cover a bed anymore but plenty wide enough for a wall. 1.5 inches of dead air sat behind every one of them, trapped between cloth and log. Her grandmother had done the same thing in a cabin outside Eau Claire 30 years before, back when the Vantine name was still Vasterling, and the Wisconsin pineries took a brother from her. The winter, the wood ran short. "Cold doesn't come through a wall," the old woman used to say, working a needle by lamplight. "It comes through the gap in the wall. Stop the gap, you've stopped the cold." Sarah hadn't believed it until she'd measured her own woodpile against the bitter weeks of December and found she was burning a third less to hold the same heat. And even then the belief had felt less like faith and more like arithmetic. She could not afford to get wrong. She'd been doing that arithmetic every morning since Thomas left, walking out to the woodpile before first light and counting splits the way another woman might count coins. 11 days left, at last count. Maybe 10 now after last night's burn. Thomas had laughed at her the morning he rode out. Not unkindly, he laughed at most things that frightened her. It was a habit of his. She'd married along with the rest of him, and told her the herd mattered more than the woodpile, this once. Because a man who lost his cattle to a storm he could have beaten by 2 days' riding had no business calling himself a rancher come spring. "I'll be back before you've missed me," he'd said, swinging up into the saddle with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about the weather and had no reason yet to believe this was the year that changed. 6 days he'd been gone, riding south with Joe Crane to find what was left of the herd before the second storm sealed the basin shut, and a man on a horse made that ride in two, found the cattle, or didn't, and came home. A man on foot, dragging his leg through snow that had already taken the fence line, was not coming home from an errand that went the way it was supposed to. The telegraph line into the basin had gone down 9 days back, somewhere between here and Buffalo, and nobody had ridden out to fix it, because nobody in their right mind was riding anywhere that wasn't a matter of livestock or life itself. Word had still found its way along the creeks the way it always did out here. Neighbor to neighbor on whatever errand couldn't wait. The Hargrove place had lost better than half its herd already, drifted against a fence line and smothered standing up, frozen where they'd huddled for warmth until the warmth ran out entirely. Sarah had heard that news 3 days ago and had gone straight out afterward to recount the woodpile, twice, as though the arithmetic of split logs could somehow answer for the arithmetic of dead cattle, and had found no comfort in either number. She crossed to the door and lifted the Winchester down from its pegs, more from habit than from any thought that she'd need it, and stood with her hand on the latch, watching the shape resolve itself out of the white, the way a fact resolves itself out of dread, slowly, and then all at once. It fell once, 20 yards out, and got up slower than a man should be able to get up in that kind of cold. She had the door open and the wind tearing into the room before she decided to open it at all. Joe Crane's beard had ice in it thick enough to crack. He came across the threshold the way a man comes into a church he doesn't believe in anymore, grateful and ashamed of needing to be. She got an arm under him and felt how little resistance was left in his weight, how his right hand, when it brushed her sleeve, didn't close around the cloth the way a hand should. "Where's Thomas?" She had the door shut and barred before the question finished leaving her mouth. He didn't answer right away. He looked past her toward the stove, toward May and Daniel watching from the nest of blankets with the particular stillness of children who understand more than anyone has told them. And something in his face did the work his voice wasn't ready for yet. Horse went down on him. Joe's words came out cracked, spaced wrong, a man relearning how to use a jaw that had been clenched shut for hours. Past Spring Creek crossing, pinned under it. I rode for help till the horse give out under me too, and then I walked the rest. Sarah had already started peeling the glove from his ruined hand before the sentence ended, and that was the only mercy she allowed herself to be, doing something with her hands, while the rest of her took the news, the way a wall takes weather, holding even as the cold found every gap. "He's alive," Joe said before she could ask, because the question was sitting on her face plain enough to read by lamplight. "He was alive when I left him. I don't know how long that holds." He said it again, quieter, like a man confessing something instead of reporting it. "I should have been riding behind him on that wash crossing, not ahead. I told him I knew the ground. I didn't know it as well as I said I did." His good hand closed into a fist against the blanket, the only part of him with the strength left to make a fist at all. Sarah didn't answer that. There would be time later to decide what blame belonged where, and right now, blame was a luxury, same as falling apart was, scheduled for whenever this was over. The fire had to be built up before anything else, and Sarah built it with the deliberate, furious calm of a woman who has decided that falling apart is a luxury scheduled for later. She packed Joe's hand and forearm in snow, first old wisdom, slow the thaw, keep the damage from doubling, then wrapped him in the heaviest robe in the house, and set May to spooning broth into him while she paced the floor and made Joe say it all again. Every detail, because details were the only rope she had to climb down into what had actually happened. The horse had broken through a snow bridge over a frozen wash and gone down hard, rolling, and Thomas's leg had gone under it wrong. Not a clean break by the sound of it. He'd been conscious enough to curse and to send Joe for help, and not conscious enough, by the time Joe lost sight of the line shack roof in the wind, to have gotten himself out from under the animal. Could you not free him? It wasn't really a question. She already knew the answer from the state of Joe's hands. Horse weighed 1,100 pounds dead, ma'am, and it was dead before I got the saddle clear. Joe's jaw worked like it cost him something. I couldn't lever it with what I had. I barely got a blanket over him before I lit out. She looked at the window, at the gray going to a deeper gray. That meant 2 hours of light left if she was generous about it, 3 if she wasn't. The line shack sat 4 miles north past Spring Creek, a distance, a sound horse covered in under an hour, on a clear day, and a distance that could swallow a man whole, in a storm that had already taken down fence posts and grown men both. "I'll need you to ride with me," she said. "I can't hardly close this hand around a rein." Joe held it up, and even through the wrappings, she could see what the cold had started doing to his fingers. "You'd be hauling me as much as I'd be helping you. Then you'll point the way, and I'll do the rest." She was already moving toward the trunk, where the rope and the canvas sled runners were kept. The ones Thomas had built 2 winters back for hauling deer carcasses down off the bench, never once imagining what else they might be asked to carry. May, her daughter, was already standing. "You keep that stove fed. You keep your brother warm, and you keep that door barred, and you do not open it for anybody who isn't your father, your mother, or Joe Crane, and you'll know us by our voices before you ever see our faces. Can you do that?" May's chin came up, the particular stubborn lift that was her father's exactly. "Yes, ma'am." Out at the barn, the horses had smelled the change in the household before Sarah ever got the door open. and the gray gelding that usually stood for harnessing without complaint reared half against his rope the moment she came at him, with the sled traces in the lantern light, ears flat, hooves cracking down hard enough on the frozen dirt to throw chips of ice against the stall boards. Joe tried to catch the lead with his good hand and missed, the rope burning out through fingers too cold to close properly, and for 3 long seconds the animal had the run of the barn, slamming a shoulder into a feed bin and sending a tin pail clattering off into the dark. Sarah didn't chase him. She backed off 2 steps, dropped her voice low, and waited the way her father had taught her, to wait out a spooked animal patient as a held breath until the gelding's ears came forward again and his head dropped enough that she could close the distance without a fight. She had the harness buckled and the sled traces secured inside of 10 minutes, her bare fingers gone clumsy and slow against the cold iron of the buckles, Joe standing useless and furious at his own ruined hands beside her, holding the lantern because it was the one thing left he could still do. "You'll have to lead my horse too," he said. "I don't trust this hand on a rein past the first mile." "I figured as much." She checked the last strap, hard, and swung up. "Point me north, and don't waste breath apologizing for it." 4 miles north and a little east, in a line shack with one window shuttered and the other letting in a blade of white light that had stopped moving an hour ago, Thomas Vantine was talking to a dead horse because there was nothing else in the room that could hear him. "You always did spook at shadows," he said, and his voice came out thinner than he meant it to. The animal lay across his lower leg with the terrible, total stillness of something that had stopped being an animal and started being a weight. And the leg beneath it had gone past pain into something Thomas didn't have a good word for, a kind of distant roaring silence that frightened him more than the pain had. He'd gotten the blanket Joe left him up over his chest and most of his arms, and he'd been working a strip of rawhide between his back teeth for the better part of an hour. Not for any reason except that his jaw wanted to clench shut permanently, and chewing kept it from locking. The shack's little stove sat 8 feet away, dead and cold, may as well have been on the moon. He'd tried dragging himself toward it twice, and stopped both times when the world went white at the edges and threatened to take him somewhere he wasn't sure he'd come back from. He thought, in the strange sideways way a mind wanders when the body has stopped arguing with the cold, about the morning he'd ridden out, laughing at his wife's woodpile arithmetic, and wondered whether a man got to take that kind of foolishness back, or whether it simply sat on a ledger somewhere, waiting to be collected. He thought about May's stubborn chin and Daniel's off-key humming, and decided, with the flat certainty of a man too tired to argue with himself, that he had no intention of being the entry that balanced that particular ledger. The light through the shutter crack had gone from white to the color of a held breath, the particular blue that comes just before a winter sky commits to dark. Somewhere outside, far off, a sound that might have been wind shifting through the rocks at the bench's edge, or might have been nothing at all. He decided to believe it was something. A man pinned under a dead horse in a line shack 4 miles from his own children could afford that much. "Hold on," he told the horse, or himself, or nobody. "Somebody's coming." Back at the cabin, with the door barred and her mother and Joe Crane gone out into weather that had already eaten the fence line, May Vantine did the only thing she knew how to do, which was the thing her mother had taught her. She checked the quilts. The one over the north wall, the log cabin pattern she'd watched her mother trade eggs for, had slipped its batten on the bottom corner sometime in the last day, just enough that a blade of cold was finding its way in along the floor. She dragged the bench over, climbed up despite her brother telling her she'd fall, and drove the loose nail back home with the flat of a hammer too big for her hand, the way she'd watched her mother do it 3 weeks ago. Behind the cloth, in that thin, trapped pocket of still air, she couldn't see anything happening at all. But the room got warmer almost the moment she fixed it, the way it always did, and that was proof enough for an 8-year-old that the wall was doing its work even with both her parents gone. "Sing the one about the river," Daniel said from his nest of blankets, in the voice of a boy who had decided not to cry and needed something to do instead. So she sang it, off-key and too slow, and fed the stove exactly the way her mother had shown her, one log at a time, never more than the fire needed. Because every log not burned tonight was a log that might matter tomorrow. She checked the woodbox count twice the way she'd seen her mother do it, moving her lips over numbers that meant more to her now than they had a week ago. Outside, the wind found every gap it could and was turned back, again and again, by cloth and dead air, and a girl too young to know she was performing an act of engineering her own grandmother would have recognized on sight. Sarah led the second horse out past the corral gate into wind that took the breath clean out of a body and made you go find it again. Joe sat his saddle with his ruined hand tucked inside his coat, pointing the way north with his chin because pointing with anything else cost too much. 4 miles, he said. Maybe less if the drifts haven't moved the landmarks. Then we'd best not lose any light arguing about it. She mounted, and the cabin behind her shrank fast into a smear of gray and gold against a white that had no edges left in it at all. And somewhere out past Spring Creek, a man she had married 9 years ago in a church with no heat and a preacher with a cold was running out of hours under the weight of a dead horse, and the only thing standing between that fact and the rest of her life was 4 miles of country that had already proven, this winter, exactly what it was capable of taking. The wind did not let up so much as it changed its argument, coming sideways instead of head-on, finding the seams in a coat the way it had found the seams in a wall. And Sarah learned in the first half-mile that the trick with the quilts worked because dead air didn't move. And out here, every single thing was moving, and there was no dead air left anywhere in the whole white world to hide behind. Joe's hand failed twice on the second mile, the rein slipping loose from fingers that no longer reported back what they were or weren't holding, and both times Sarah closed the gap and took his horse's lead in. Her free hand, without a word, because a word cost breath, and breath was the one thing out here she couldn't spend twice. They came to the Spring Creek crossing where the ice had gone gray and uncertain along one bank, thinner there than it should have been this deep into the season, and Sarah walked the horses 50 yards upstream to a spot where the current ran fast enough underneath to keep the ice honest, testing each step with the butt of the hatchet before she trusted her own weight to it, let alone the weight of 2 horses and the sled. The crossing cost them 6 minutes they didn't have, and she counted every one of them against the failing light, without once letting her hands slow down. They lost the landmarks once, exactly where Joe had warned they might, the bench that should have shown black rock through the snow showing nothing but more snow, and Sarah held the horses still for 4 long minutes, while Joe turned his face into the wind and listened for the sound of Spring Creek running under its ice. A sound that had not stopped since the day it was born, and would not stop now, because the creek did not care what the sky was doing to the men and women living along its banks. There, he found it more by feel than hearing. Bare, left. The light, when they crested the last rise and saw the line shack's black shape hunched against the snow, had gone the color of a bruise healing. And Sarah understood without being told that they had perhaps 20 minutes of true sight left in the day. And after that, whatever happened, happened by feel. Thomas was alive. He told her so himself, in a voice gone thin as creek ice, the moment she got the door shouldered open against a drift that had piled itself half up the frame. "Took you long enough," he said, and the joke cost him more than it was worth. And she heard it crack halfway through and didn't say a word about that either. The horse across his leg had frozen into the ground beneath it, fused there by its own dying warmth and the night's cold, and the girth strap that should have given under a knife's edge had iced into something closer to iron. Sarah worked the hatchet from the sled's lashings and went at the leather with short, hard strokes, her bare fingers. She'd stripped the gloves to get a grip that mattered, going numb in a way that frightened her more than anything Joe had said back at the cabin. And still, she did not stop, because stopping meant a man froze to death 8 feet from his own rescue. "Get the bar from the sled," she told Joe. "The iron one, under the rope." He brought it with the hand that still worked, and together they set it under the carcass's shoulder, and Sarah put her whole weight against it, the way she'd once seen her father move a felled pine off a trapped dog, and the dead animal gave an inch, 2, not enough. And she swore once, plainly, and reset her boots in the frozen dirt, and drove down again until it gave a third time. Enough, enough, for Thomas to drag the ruined leg free, with a sound through his teeth that she would not let herself name, because naming it would have stopped her hands from finishing the work. They splinted the leg with the iron bar itself, and what was left of a saddle blanket, Thomas gripping a strip of leather between his teeth, while Sarah worked the knots tight enough to hold and loose enough to leave the blood moving, and they got him onto the sled in a dark that had finally, fully arrived. Sarah led 2 horses and a sled, carrying her husband back across 4 miles of country that had taken half the cattle in the basin that winter, and meant, plainly, to take more before spring, by a kind of reckoning that had nothing to do with sight, and everything to do with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had already decided, weeks ago, that this family was not going to be one more thing the cold got to keep. The cabin window was still gold when they came over the last rise, which meant the stove was still fed, which meant an 8-year-old girl had done exactly what she'd been told for 6 hours straight in a house with no adult in it. May had the door open, and the bar lifted before Sarah called out, recognizing the particular shape of 3 returning instead of 2. And the warmth that rolled out into the night air smelled like wood smoke and tallow, and the specific, ordinary miracle of a room that had held its heat. They got Thomas onto the bed closest to the stove. The leg was bad, broken through, not clean, the kind of break a circuit doctor 4 days' ride away would shake his head over, come spring. And Sarah understood, setting the splint properly by lamplight, while her husband gripped a strip of leather between his teeth, that the herd they'd ridden out to save was mostly gone already, lost to drifts and starvation, in a winter the whole territory would talk about for 30 years. Victory, out here, never arrived without a bill attached to it. But Daniel fell asleep against his father's good leg before the splint was even finished. The particular boneless sleep of a child whose fear has finally found somewhere safe to put itself down. And May sat by the stove feeding it logs one at a time, the same careful rationing she'd practiced all night, glancing now and then at the quilt on the north wall like she was checking on something she'd helped raise herself. Thomas would not walk without a hitch in his step for the rest of his life, though none of them knew that yet, not that first night, with the splint still warm from her hands and the fever still a week off. Joe Crane kept 2 fingers on his right hand that never fully felt heat or cold again the same way, and he stayed on with the Vantines 3 more years after that winter, longer than any hired hand usually stayed anywhere, as if a man who'd nearly died on another family's account owed that family something no wage could settle. None of it was spoken of as debt. It simply was what it was. The way the basin itself simply was what it was. Generous in summer, merciless in the particular winter that took its name from what it did to the cattle, and entirely indifferent to which household survived it and which did not. Sarah stood in the doorway a long while after the lamp was turned low, looking at 4 walls dressed in pieced cloth that had once been wedding gifts and crib covers and a dead grandmother's careful needlework, walls that had held a fraction more heat for a fraction less wood every single day since she'd nailed them up, buying her family the margin that let a girl of 8 keep a fire fed long enough for her mother to bring her father home. The wind outside had finally quit arguing. It simply stopped, the way storms in that country always eventually did, all at once and without apology, leaving behind a silence that had to be filled in slowly, the way a held breath is let out. Come spring, the basin would count its losses in cattle by the thousands, and its dead in numbers nobody liked to say out loud at church. And the Vantine place would count itself lucky for what it had kept, rather than sorry for what it had lost, which was its own kind of arithmetic, the only kind that mattered once the snow finally let go of the ground. Other families along the Powder and the Bighorn would learn, too late or just in time, the same trick Sarah had carried west from a dead woman's cabin in Wisconsin, that warmth was rarely a matter of how much wood a body could find, and far more a matter of where a body let the cold get in. Some houses along those creeks still hang quilts that way on cold nights, on walls with furnaces humming behind them now, for reasons the family living there couldn't fully explain if you asked. It might be a question worth asking somebody you know.